something incredibly fascinating. We're unpacking a highly structured apologetics seminar by Dr. Rick Griffith titled Engaging the Atheists. We'll be looking neutrally and directly at the strategies, the arguments, and the specific rhetoric used in this classic modern debate, the Bible versus atheism.
Okay, let's dive into this. The entire foundation of this debate, according to the seminar, rests on one massive philosophical question. It's simply this: how does God relate to the world? The way a person answers this single question completely dictates their worldview. It is literally the dividing line that separates different cultures, belief systems, and modern philosophical arguments today.
So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the clash of worldviews, move into the knowledge pie chart, tackle creation versus evolution, look at defending biblical reliability, examine the historical evidence for Jesus, and finally wrap up with responding to modern culture.
Let's hit Section 1, the clash of worldviews, understanding foundational perspectives.
To make sense of all this, the source uses a religious worldview chart to map out every perspective. Notice how the whole thing branches based entirely on the existence of God. On one side, you've got atheism, which is defined simply as the belief that God does not exist. Right next to it is agnosticism, the belief that I don't really know if God exists. Then, on the other side, under the premise that God does exist, we find theism. And that branches down into biblical Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and others. The seminar essentially uses this visual framework to identify exactly where a person stands philosophically before ever engaging them.
All right, Section 2, the knowledge pie chart, a practical conversational tactic. Now, what's really interesting here is a highly specific, three-step psychological exercise the seminar teaches for conversations. It goes like this. First, you draw a circle representing literally all the knowledge in the universe. Second, you hand the pen to the person identifying as an atheist and ask them to draw a tiny slice representing what they personally know out of all that possible knowledge. The source points out that even the most confident person will claim to know less than half. Finally, step 3, the catch. You ask, since you only know this small percentage, could God exist in the massive majority of the pie you don't know about? According to the seminar, conceding that they don't know everything theoretically shifts their position from strict atheism to agnosticism.
Moving right along to Section 3, Creation versus Evolution, the origin of death and suffering.
So, the seminar argues that the book of Genesis is absolutely foundational to understanding the very concept of death. If we look at the evolution timeline, it shows millions of years of death, suffering, and disease happening long before mankind ever existed. But the creation timeline completely flips this. It shows mankind being created in a perfect environment and death only entering the world as a direct result of man's actions. The source material strongly emphasizes that these two models present fundamentally incompatible views on where suffering actually comes from.
To back this up, the seminar points to what it calls the problems of the fossil record for anyone trying to mix evolution with the Bible. The argument here is that if the biblical account states things like thorns, disease, and death only came after mankind's fall, well then, finding fossil thorns dated 400 million years ago or discovering cancer in dinosaur bones presents a pretty massive theological problem. The crucial takeaway is that the seminar actively uses this specific data to argue against evolutionary timelines entirely.
Section 4, Defending Biblical Reliability, Responding to Modern Textual Attacks.
The Bible is a product of man, my dear, not of God. History has never had a definitive version of the book. You've probably heard sentiments like this before, right? This specific quote comes directly from the fictional character Lee Teabing in Dan Brown's wildly popular novel The Da Vinci Code. The seminar actually points to pop culture phenomena like this to demonstrate how modern culture subjectively attacks the reliability of Scripture, arguing that society often prefers entertaining fiction over historical objectivity.
And this brilliantly illustrates the seminar's counter-argument. The source compares the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, which date all the way back to 200 BC, with the Masoretic text from the year 1000 AD. In the 166 Hebrew words of Isaiah chapter 53, over a gap of literally more than 1,000 years of hand copying, there are only 17 letter differences. And get this, those differences are purely spelling and style. They have absolutely zero impact on the actual meaning of the text.
5,686. Let that number sink in for a second. According to the source material, this is the current count of ancient Greek manuscript copies of the New Testament. And when you combine that with other languages, the total soars way past 24,000. The seminar uses this massive volume of ancient copies, some dating as close as 150 years to the originals, to claim a staggering 97 to 98% textual certainty.
It's a fierce counter to the pop culture narrative that the text has just been lost to time.
Section 5. Historical evidence for Jesus. Early, non-Christian historical accounts.
Now, the seminar is highly focused on proving that Jesus wasn't just a religious figure, but a documented historical one. To do this, they look outside the Bible. In AD 93, the Jewish historian Josephus writes about James, explicitly identifying him as the brother of Jesus. A bit later, in AD 113, Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor, writes to the emperor about Christians singing hymns to Christ as if to a god. And by AD 120, the renowned Roman historian Tacitus references the execution of Christ. The source leans heavily on these three specific 1st and 2nd century historians to validate historicity from a purely secular standpoint.
But here's where it gets really transparent. The source material actually acknowledges that well-meaning Christians likely interpolated, which is a fancy way of saying they secretly added words into the text of Josephus over the centuries. For example, the more historically reliable Arabic version says Jesus was perhaps the Messiah and was crucified. The later altered Christian version confidently declares he was the Messiah and tacks on details about the resurrection. The seminar imparts this to show that even when you strip away those Christian additions, you're still left with a solid, secular historical core confirming Jesus' life and crucifixion.
Finally, Section 6. Responding to modern culture. The seminar's ultimate strategy.
So what do we do with all this? The seminar issues a final call to action. First, you have to know the text thoroughly. But here is the real kicker. The source makes a bold claim that when engaging an atheist, their rejection of God is usually not rooted in some deep philosophical or theological difference. Instead, it's often rooted in a deep personal hurt caused by a believer in their past. The ultimate strategy taught here is to listen to that hurt, utilize the pie chart to gently shift their perspective on what they truly know, and finally, share a simple message of faith.
And that brings us to our final, provocative thought for the day. Look, whether you agree with the premises presented here or not, you've just seen the exact playbook being taught to defend these viewpoints in the real world. So I have to ask you, how does understanding these apologetic strategies change the way you view modern religious debates? The next time you see these cultural clashes happening on social media or on TV, do you think you'll be able to spot the pie chart tactic or the manuscript argument at play? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next Explain.